Everybody, this is Dream, and before I get started, thank you guys for liking, commenting, and subscribing. If you haven't subscribed yet, please hit that button. Also hit that like button. With that said, let's get into this particular main slate here. So we have two slates on DraftKings today that we're going to take a look at. This video is going to be for the main slate that starts at 1 p.m. I don't know why they made this the main slate and not the later slate, but regardless, this is the main slate. So without further ado, let's get into it. So the teams that are the most stackable in this situation are Boston, Chicago White Sox, Detroit, and Kansas City. Obviously, this slate is kind of funky. You can also like Baltimore a little bit here. As the pitchers go, we have Lucas Giolito for Chicago White Sox pitching. He's been pretty inconsistent, but he should get around 5 or 6 strikeouts in this particular game. And Minnesota hasn't been all that good lately, and they really don't project well on this particular slate. And so I think he's a pretty solid option as your first pitcher. And then Ranger Suarez is pretty much the other guy that I think is useful here. He's going up against the Cubs, who haven't been very good. He's going to get 4 or 5 strikeouts probably, and that gives him some upside in this matchup, but he's very inconsistent. But he's just one of the few guys on this particular slate that you can look at that really have some potential to go deep in the game. You could take a look at Nathan Eovaldi as well against Baltimore, but I really don't like him, for one, because he's going up against Baltimore, so he's been playing pretty good, and two, he's probably going to be on a pretty hefty pitch count, so even if he starts off pretty good, he's probably not going to play very deep. Giolito and Suarez are literally the only guys that I think are even remotely reasonable on this particular slate. And even rostering both of them, you still have $4,000 for each position, so it's not like you're getting super handicapped either, because there's just nobody on the slate that's super expensive. But a lot of these guys are just not very good, and I mean you can see with their average fantasy points per game, all of these guys are under 11 fantasy points. I don't really see any situation here that is particularly great. I mean Jonathan Heasley, but it's not even that good of a situation. So let's go ahead and get into the catchers that I do like here. Now, there is potential that William Contreras actually plays for the Cubs, and if that actually does happen, which he's played yesterday, so we'll see. I don't necessarily think that he will, but his price is also pretty expensive. But here's somebody I just wanted to mention. He may end up playing. But my top option is Adley Rutschman for Baltimore here. He's averaging 7.6 for the last 10 games, including 2 home runs, and he's a really solid option. Both catchers for Kansas City, Melendez and Perez, are both in play here. I like Melendez a little bit better. He's averaging 10 fantasy points a game for the last 10. He's had some really big games. Perez is still in a good spot, but and because he's hitting the ball so good, 325, and averaging 8.5, but I still think Melendez is in a better spot overall. And then finally, if he starts, a good cheap option here is Reese McGuire. He's averaging almost 8 fantasy points. He's had 3 home runs the last 10. He's a little bit boomer bust, but he's in a good position here if he can play. At first base, we've got 3 guys to really take a good look at here. The first being Ryan Mountcastle. He's pretty much the top option on this particular slate. He's been hitting the ball extremely well lately, and I think he's in a great spot here. He's literally the only guy that's really great right on the slate, but Pasquinto for Kansas City is also a decent option. He's averaging 9.7 last 10, including 421, and I do like him in this particular situation simply because he's hitting the ball so well lately. And then for Kansas City, and then finally Tristan Casas. He's just been hitting the ball extremely well for Boston. I suspect this Boston-Baltimore game is going to be pretty high scoring. So he's also hitting 308 with 9.1 the last 10. He's only played 21 games so far, but he's having some really big games. He is a little bit boomer bust, but he's somebody to consider at this position. At second base, my goodness, it was hard to find some value here. Lots of injuries, lots of people are probably going to sit out. But one of the safer options is Kiki Hernandez, averaging about 6.5 fantasy points a game. And then the other guy I decently like here is Odor for Baltimore. He's averaging almost 8 fantasy points a game in the last 10 games. And he's hitting the ball pretty well as of late, so I think he's in a pretty good spot here, and so he's somebody to consider. You could also take a look at Nick Gordon, but I like him more. I don't really love him on this slate simply because of the pitching matchup against Giolito, but he is somebody you could take a look at. And at third base, we have Hunter Dozier. Let's see here. He's kind of a secondary option here, but Kansas City is in a good spot here. He's also hitting 300, 7.6 the last 10 games. Kansas City actually seems like they're hitting the ball pretty well right this moment. Uh, then we have Gunnar Henderson for Baltimore. If he plays, he's somebody that I like in this particular matchup. He's been pretty good against Boston this season. The last two games, the last game he actually started, he had 2 fantasy points. But still, I think he's in a solid spot here against Eovaldi. Eovaldi's a guy I tend to like to get guys on. And then Yoan Moncada, if he does play, which he may or may not play here, if he does play though, he's somebody I like against Maryland. And then Rafael Devers is a super safe option that's super expensive at hitting almost 10 fantasy points a game, 366. He's just hitting the ball extremely well. And in a nice plus matchup, that's always something nice to utilize. I think you pretty much need to lock in him at that position as well, just because it's pricey. It is high, but you can afford to do it on the slate. There's plenty of value in the outfield, what I'm about to show you. At shortstop, my goodness, it is, we're going to be scratching for something here. Obviously, you could use Gunnar Henderson. You could also take a look at Elvis Andrus, but I actually like Javier Baez a little bit better here. He's been hitting pretty well, 256, 7 fantasy points a game last 10. And then also Jorge Mateo for Baltimore. I feel like he's in a pretty good spot. He hadn't been hitting the ball very well, but he hadn't hit the ball that great all season. But he's been pretty good against Boston, and so I think he's in a good spot here. You could also take a look at Bobby Witt Jr., who is averaging almost 10 fantasy points a game, though he's pretty expensive, and I don't really love paying for him at that price point. He's basically hit Trout levels of expense, and so I don't really love him, but you still could consider him at this position. In the outfielder, we have some really good value options here. One is Gavin Sheets. For Chicago White Sox. He has actually been hitting the ball 300 the last 10 games, and he's hitting 6.2 fantasy points a game. And for his price point, he can definitely pay off. Akil Badu for Detroit has really been hitting the ball well, hitting 8.2 fantasy points a game, almost 300 batting average. Even hit a home run. Not a big home run threat, but he is hitting the ball pretty well, and he's one of the safer options. You also go. You can see the 0, but he actually didn't play that game. He sometimes doesn't play super deep in the game, but he's still somebody I think that's great on this particular slate. Austin Hayes has been hitting the ball pretty well against Boston the last few games, and I think he's in a good spot here. And then we also have Cedric Mullins. He's obviously pretty expensive on the slate, but he's somebody who's been hitting the ball pretty good, and he has a home run threat in this particular matchup. And then Verdugo for Boston, another guy I really like here, averaging 8.7 fantasy points a game. And then, let's see here, we have Olivieres for Kansas City. If he plays, he's averaging 7.7 the last 10, and he's been hitting 333. I really like Kansas City on this particular slate. They look pretty decent, the more I look at them. And then Riley Green for Detroit is a guy that you can consider here. He's averaging 7.2 the last 10. He's been very streaky throughout the season, but he's in a good spot right now. And then Anthony Santander, he's averaging almost 10 fantasy points a game. He's been pretty solid again. He's had some really massive games with two home runs in 3 of the last 5 games. The other 2 games he was 0, so it's a very boomer bust situation for him right now. But he is hitting the ball pretty well when he does hit it. And then Tommy Pham for Boston, he's averaging 8.5 fantasy points a game. He's been hitting the ball pretty good. A little bit boomer bust here. And then JD Martinez, he's somebody I've enjoyed rostering as a pretty decent priced option here, and he's been great against Baltimore this season, almost averaging 10 fantasy points a game. So overall, this slate, while it's small, you have plenty of good options available. In order to win this kind of, in order to take down like a GPP on this slate, you do need to make some, take some risk and stuff. But there's plenty of availability, and you got plenty of value, even if you pay up for the top 2 pitchers. When it comes to the money, well, at least 2 of the top 3. I really wouldn't recommend Eovaldi, but I think it's a pretty solid slate for hitters, especially. So, with that said, thank you guys for liking, commenting, and subscribing. If you have any comments or questions about the slate, feel free to leave them below. And have a nice day, guys.